Kia ora, welcome back to ECG Boot Camp, an introduction to ECG interpretation by a med student for med students. This is video number 6, rhythm 3. Recapping what we've learnt so far, we talked about a system for analysing an ECG, RRAPWQST. We talked about rate. You can either get that by taking 300 divided by the number of large squares between R waves, or the number of QRS in the rhythm strip multiplied by 6. We talked about a system for starting to understand the rhythm. Is it fast or slow? Is it regular or irregular? And if it's irregular, is it regularly or irregularly irregular? We talked about whether the QRS is wide or narrow. Wide means greater than 3 small squares. We talked about whether there are P waves and what the relationship of P waves is to the QRS complex. We had a look at an ECG in normal sinus rhythm, meaning that it's at a normal rate. This one's at about 75 beats per minute, and that there are P waves before every QRS complex, meaning it's coming from the SA node, the sinoatrial node, so it's a sinus rhythm. And we talked about a few tachyarrhythmias, so fast rhythms, and the patterns that we need to recognise: a sinus tachycardia, narrow complex tachycardia with P waves; a junctional tachycardia or SVT, narrow complex tachycardia with no P waves; atrial fibrillation, those irregular QRS complexes and no P waves; atrial flutter with that sawtooth pattern and a rate divisible into 300, ventricular tachycardia, which was our broad complex tachycardia, and ventricular fibrillation, which was this disorganised electrical rhythm, meaning that our ventricles are not beating in synchrony. So now we're going to have a talk about heart block. So there are different degrees of heart block, and we're going to go through them here. Heart block just means that there's an interruption between the signal at the atrium and what's happening in the ventricles. So this first one here, at first glance, doesn't look very abnormal at all. And when you're figuring out the rhythm, you probably wouldn't look at this and immediately notice that anything was amiss. But we're going to talk about it here because it's one of the degrees of heart block and it's one to know about. So first degree heart block is just where there is a longer than normal PR interval. So there is PR greater than 5 small squares as first degree heart block. And so the PR interval should be 3 to 5 small squares. All right, so moving on to this next one. So what's happening here? We've got a P wave, a QRS, a P wave a bit further away from another QRS, a P wave a bit further away again from this QRS, a P wave, no QRS, and then a P wave that's pretty close to the QRS. So we can see that our PR interval is getting longer and longer. We lose a QRS complex and then it's short again. So this is secondary degree heart block, and it's Mobitz type 1, which is just a way of classifying heart block. And this phenomenon is called Wenke back. And so that is progressive PR prolongation and then a missed beat. And this can be a benign phenomenon. Moving on to this next one here, we've got a P wave, QRS, a P wave, QRS, same distance, P wave, QRS, P wave, nothing, P wave, QRS. So what we've got here is that our PR interval stays the same, but we lose a QRS complex. So second degree heart block, Mobitz type 2, is a heart block where you get PR not prolonging progressively but you get intermittent missed beats. And so this, unlike winky back, this is not a benign phenomenon because it can herald or signal that a complete heart block is coming and that someone might need a pacemaker. So there are different types of this type of block. So you can have a beat dropped regularly. So in this situation, we've got a P wave, QRS, 2 Ps, QRS, 2 Ps, QRS. So this is a 2-to-1 block here. And by the same token, you could get a 3-to-1 and a 4-to-1. And obviously in those situations, the fewer P waves are being conducted to become a QRS complex, the slower your heart rate's going to go. And you do need to have the heart going fast enough that it's pushing enough blood, I guess, essentially. So, yeah, you can have sufficiently slow that you don't have sufficient cardiac output. All right, so this final one is 3rd degree heart block. And this is where, okay, we've got a P wave, maybe a P wave in there, P. So I think that's a P wave hiding in that T wave there. So there is a regular beating of the P waves, but their relationship to the QRS complexes is pretty much random. So we've got these QRS complexes and they're narrow, so the signal must be coming from somewhere, probably from the AV node, the junctional kind of rhythm. And there's no real relationship between the P wave and that QRS complex. So this one is 3rd degree or complete heart block. So there's complete dissociation between the atria and the ventricles, and it's going really slowly because that intrinsic rhythm that we have in other parts of the conductance system is taking over. And so, no relationship between P and QRS. So just recapping that, our types of heart block are our 1st degree, which is just a prolonged PR interval. 2nd degree, Mobitz type 1 or winky back, where we get our progressive PR prolongation and then a missed beat. 2nd degree, Mobitz type 2, we get PR not prolonging progressively, you just get the intermittent missed beats. And that can come in different forms like a 2-to-1 block, 3-to-1, etc. And then 3rd degree or complete heart block, we've got no relationship between the atrial and ventricular electrical activity. So something else to talk about in this part of our series is what I've called extra beats for expert hearts. And this is about escape versus ectopic beats. So an escape beat is a situation where, because there's been enough of a pause of your sinus beating, one of the slower intrinsic rhythms further down the conducting system has been able to escape or get a beat in. So it's allowing the AV node or the ventricle to get a word in each ways, basically, because the sinus is shut up. And so what happens there is that you have a pause and then a beat, and then potentially you resume sinus activity, just depending on what's going on. So in this one, these are sort of abnormal looking P waves, aren't they? They're upside down, but we're just going to ignore that and pretend that they're not because we aren't interested in that for the moment. So we've got sinus beat, pause, and then no P wave, but there is a narrow complex QRS that's come in here. And so no P wave, but a narrow complex. We know that that's probably coming from the junction, so an AV nodal type situation. And then we've resumed a sinus beat here. So this one is a junctional escape beat. And you could have that persisting, but in this situation, it's just a single escape beat. And so this next one, we've got a sinus beat, and then it's paused for long enough that a ventricle's taken over. We know that's a ventricular beat because it's wide and it's funny looking. And then this one's actually persisted in having another ventricular beat. So this one is a ventricular escape beat. And I know this is kind of a bradyarrhythmias talk, but I wanted to just cover this as well, just the difference between, and so it may not be Brady, this one, but the difference between escape and ectopics, which can be a little bit confusing. So ectopic beats are extra beats that come early. So whereas an escape beat comes after a pause, so it's basically the heartbeat coming late, right? An ectopic beat is one that comes early, and they can be from they can be atrial, they can be junctional, they can be ventricular. But so here we've got sinus beat, early beat with a P wave, and then a bit of a pause, and then we've just resumed our sinus rhythm there. So this one is an atrial ectopic beat. So here we've got a sinus beat, sinus beat, sinus beat, and then this is weird, kind of upside down P wave or something. We're just gonna, for this, we're actually just gonna pretend there's not a P wave there. It's gonna make our lives easier. And we've got a QRS complex, and then we've got a bit of a pause, tends to be a bit of a pause afterwards, and then we're having some kind of beat here. I'm not sure if I'm convinced about a P wave there, but at any rate, we're going to say that this was junctional ectopic. It's certainly not a kind of normal looking P wave there, but let's just say that there's not a confusing wee bit there to confuse us. Confuse me anyway. I'm new to this. All right, and so this one is got normal, normal. Oh, here's this big weird one, bit of a gap, normal, normal. Oh, another big weird one and a wee gap. So these are ventricular ectopics. We know they're ventricular because they're wide and weird looking. They don't look like your normal QRS complex. So in the extra beats, we've either got ones that come late, escape beats, or ones that come early, ectopics, and then the presence or absence of P waves, and whether the QRS complex is wide or narrow can tell us whether the origin is atrial, junctional, or ventricular. Lovely. Alrighty. So summing up, we've talked about heart block, first, second, type 1 and type 2, and third degree heart block, and we've talked about escape and ectopic beats. And so in our next video we will have finished on rhythm and we'll be moving on to have a chat about cardiac axis. So thank you for bearing with me through all of these rhythm videos, and I will see you next time. Cheers.